Okay, let's start then with some questions. Questions from last time, topics, things you want reviewed, things you want to make sure we get a chance to talk about tonight. There are enough of us on the call now to begin, and we are recording, so fire away and rest assured that if you missed something tonight, as always, you'll have the recording the following day that you can review.
So I may have missed this from one of the other lectures, but at Pacifica, we do study the Jungian psychoanalysis or psychodynamic. And what I would like to know is how to incorporate Lacanian psychology with the other forms of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and it might be something that you would want to go concept by concept with. So, for instance, I think one of the things that comes out of Seminar 10 that could be really useful for someone who does more object relations theory and practice is this little a, and what Lacan is here doing with this object that is more a cause than an object, and the move he's making with objectivity in science versus objectality in psychoanalysis. So I think, Desiree, it's probably a concept by concept tradition. Similarly, you might look at a Freudian notion, like the death drive, for instance, and work out how other folks have responded to it, and then articulate that with Lacan's notion of the death drive. But a wholesale application of one onto the other, I think is gonna leave you in a bit of a mess. So I'd say concept by concept, project by project is probably the best way to do this. And as is true with any sort of theoretical work, the test here is not so much whether it's nosebleed, theoretical and conceptual, but how useful is the fucking thing? Good theory is useful theory. And in the case of a clinician, it might be useful in helping you understand and explain where an analysand is coming from. I like Lacan because he helps me understand and explain vast areas of my life. So it's for you, it's for your work, it's for the project, and I'd say it should be driven by a specific concept. And that's a much more useful way to do this, I think. And the projects that I've seen really succeed in using Lacan, they back away from the wholesale incorporation or application of his work to another thinker's, and instead take it point by point. It's the safest, cleanest, most responsible way to do it, I think. What else?
I'll ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So on page 223, we didn't go over it last time. It's from the Buddha's eyelids chapter. He talks about Tattvamasi from the Upanishads, which is translated usually as thou art that or I am that. It's at the bottom of the first full paragraph. So when I've been speaking to Lacanians, I have equated l'autre, the big other, with the Vedantan concept of Brahman, which was translated when I was in graduate school as that without attributes. Basically, if you can say it, it's not it. And for some reason, I've been reprimanded in the past by Lacanians. So I was going to ask you, in terms of what you know about the Upanishads and Vedanta, what do you think the differences are between the concept of Brahman with an A and l'autre, the big other?
That is a great question, and it's not one that I can really speak to because I just know the Lacanian stuff. I don't know this tradition that he's dipping into very well. I can get a sense of what is at stake for him in this chapter, and you're right to start on page 223, I believe. He's very interested in something here in which nothing would be reflected. And it does have some origin in his earlier writings, as he suggests. He's interested in the parts of the mirror that do not reflect back. And we learn that in our readings for tonight too. It's the smudge or the stain or the piece of food that's stuck to the mirror that he really is intrigued by. And in this chapter, for better and for worse, titled Buddha's Eyelids, it's that part of the statue, the eye that doesn't seem to be there, even though it does give you an indication of its presence. And if you look at the statue in question, you can see exactly what he's up to here and what he's thinking. This part on 223 that is his great lead into this comes from the character at the bottom for negation. And then at the top of 223, he's messing with this not having. And then in the middle, it's kind of like mirror stage reflections. So I can't speak to the latter part of your question, Ira. I think it's great. I have a sense of people whom we could ask about this, but I can only speak to the big other and how he understands the big other. And then you could then say, does it line up with your experience of these other figures from the different tradition? So that's a long apology. It's important, though, that this is a part of Lacanian theory and technique that folks usually ignore. This guy was intrigued by Eastern thought and religion and mysticism. Remember, this is coming after the first of 2 trips that he took to Japan. He also, I believe, was fluent in Mandarin and has a master's degree, had a master's degree, I believe, in Chinese culture and language, I think is what it is. You'd have to check into it. I can't speak to it directly, but. So this is something that means a lot to him. The topic that keeps coming up in Seminar 10 relative to this Eastern tradition is the idea of desire. Desire is one of the central topics of this seminar, and it's part of what he's doing when he drags in his experience, his recent experience in Japan. But yeah, my inclination is to read 223 alongside his work with mirrors, particularly his work in the 40s, the mirror stage. That which thou dost recognize in the other is thyself.
Is that just a name of narcissism?
No, it wouldn't be. It's more basic than that. You see, what he's trying to get at here is if you scroll down a little bit on 223, he's trotting out this stuff about mirrors, which he's already been through. And then he brings up his article on psychical causality, where he does indeed bring up this notion of a mirror in which nothing is reflected. You can see it about midway through the page. Mm-hmm. But it's at the bottom of 223 that the reason why he's doing this and bringing this up starts to come clean. The paragraph begins, but if we introduce. He's trying to help us understand what this object A is. And if we introduce it as something essential in the relationship to desire, this business of dualism and non-dualism takes on a quite different relief. And then here's the key line. If what is most me lies on the outside, not because I projected it there, but because it was cut from me, the paths I shall take to retrieve it afford an altogether different variety. So the stuff at the top of the page, the passage that Ira read around that which thou dost recognize in the other is thyself, Lacan wants to say, okay, but it's not a simple projection. And it's not narcissism in the sense of thinking that everybody wants to be like you. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's something different. Because remember, at this point, he is connecting object A to the real. We saw this on page 160, 161. It's the part of the wholly embodied bioanimalistic being that can't get incorporated into the symbolic. So we talked about this mythical, presupposed here and now order of the infant's life, where they're effectively a worm, right? They live in a state of raw materiality. This is the bioanimalistic side of things that we refer to as the subject of pure need. Now, when that subject of pure need is brought into the field of the big other, of language, of society, there's always a part of them that can't be processed or metabolized by the symbolic. That part of them is always an embodied part. It always points back to their physicality, to their bioanimalistic components. And it's a part of them that is then cut out and excluded. And it is the basis for the real. The real as a register in Lacanian theory and technique was not there before the symbolic. The real is an effect structure of the symbolic. It's whatever in the symbolic can't understand, make sense of, and signify. So the real isn't even exterior to the symbolic. It's extimate, if you will. It's an intimacy that is it's an exterior that has been rendered intimate to the structure of the symbolic. So the real is not prior to the symbolic. In fact, the opposite is an effect of the symbolic. And it is not exterior to the symbolic, but in fact, it is the very structuring ingredient to the symbolic. It is the nothing that the symbolic has to have in order to legitimate its claim to account for everything in the world. That's the real. So what Lacan is here getting at is the way that object A is connected to this interior-exterior, this effect structure of symbolicity. So here at this point in his career, little a isn't just part of fantasy, this imaginative symbolic act of putting desire in operation that we know of as fantasy. Here in Seminar 10, object A starts taking on features of the real. And by that, here Lacan is referring to the human form, the body. That's why, as we're reading in the work tonight, he's starting to shift more into body parts, more into discussion of specific drive. Don't forget, all of the drives for Lacan, they emerge from a body part, an erogenous zone. And all of the erogenous zones, according to him, have the same structure. They're effectively openings in the human body that have a rim-like structure. The erogenous zones to which the drive, which is a partial satisfaction of desire, is always attached, is bodily. So the oral drive, not oral, is connected to the mouth. It's an opening in the human form that has a rim-like structure. The anal drive is connected to the anus, an opening in the human body that has a rim-like structure. The scopic drive, which is also, Ira, what he's starting to gesture towards here with Buddha's eyelids, obviously is connected to the eyelid, an opening into the human body that has a rim-like structure. The invocatory drive has its origin in the ear, which is an opening into the human body with a rim-like structure. And you could go further. You could look at pores. Name your body part. But in each case, the drive always emerges from an erogenous zone, travels out into the world, and then travels around in a circular fashion, some sort of object of desire, some cause of desire. The word for that in Lacanian algebra is object A. They all circulate around an object A and then return back to that erogenous zone. So the human form is really important here, and that's what he's getting at the bottom of 223. If what is most me lies on the outside, that's the first claim. The truth of who you are, as we've learned from communication scholars like John Durham Peters, belongs to the other. You know me better than I know myself. It's not because I project myself onto you, but because that part of me has been cut from me. It's a body part. And as a result, when we shift from projection to incision and excision, objectality, the notion of the cut, we have to travel an altogether different path in understanding what that's about. And our goal last time and tonight is going to be to walk this path a little bit.
May I ask whether, so originally I was mistaken this as explaining narcissism, but now it sounds like it's actually explaining the opposite, which is why humans are altruistic in a way, because what we think we care about the other is actually just part of ourselves. So it's trying to explain empathy and altruism.
I don't think he's messing with that here at all. In fact, I think what he's getting at, you can see it at the bottom of 223 and the top of 224. He again wants to get, first of all, to a notion of spatiality that is there whether you have mirrors at all, because the human eye is a reflective surface. And that's what's missing from the Bodhisattva statues that he encounters in Japan. They look like they have half-closed eyes, but when you look closer, they've all been rubbed away. It's an illusion. It's an illusion of an eye. And when you look closer, what you can see is an eye that doesn't look back at you. So on one hand, you have the human eye, which is a mirror surface that is there before any spatialization of the world. So he's fucking with Kant here and working with a priori notions of space and time, particularly space. The human eye, he wants to say, is already a mirror. And so he has this quip at the top of 224, where if you know, sometimes you can put two mirrors across from each other and you get an infinite reflection back and forth. He's like, you don't actually need to do that. All you need to do is stand in front of a mirror and look very, very closely at the way that that mirror is reflected in your eye. And when you look in the mirror, you can see this back and forth reflective capacity. So the eye itself is a mirror. But that's not really what he wants to get at. What he wants to get at is this notion emphasized again on page 224. It was italicized on 223. It's italicized on 224. A surface in which nothing is reflected. And I think it might be nice to read Lacan to the letter here and ask what kind of a surface can reflect the no thing. That thing becomes of the no.
Can I ask a question?
Please do. Fire away.
I read the Buddha's eye as something else. I read the half-opened eyelid indicating that the Buddha was enlightened, and thus I'm conflating the Hinduism, Vedanta, and Buddha, but at one with l'autre, at one with the big other.
That could be true, and he does make allusions to the half-closed eye of the contemplating noetic, if you will, Buddha or Bodhisattva. But on 228, the first line of the first full paragraph, if you need still more details, you may notice that there is no opening for the eyes on this statue. The statue he's looking at does not have eyes, open, closed, or halfway closed at all. So he's not looking at a statue that captures the sense of the enlightened subject in this state of reposed, almost meditative thought or contemplation in the Western tradition. That's not what he's talking about. He says it simply has, at the level of the eyes, a kind of pronounced ridge, which means that with the reflection off the wood, one always seems to be able to make out an eye. But there's nothing there in the wood. I examined the wood at length, and I made inquiries, At which point he cites Professor Kondo. And he moves on down in this paragraph at the end to talk about the slit of the eye on the statue has disappeared due to the more or less daily kneading it endures from the hands of the nuns of the convent, where it is the most precious treasure. When they think to dry the tears of this figure of archetypal divine recourse. And then at the bottom, he's on to the drives. So I find this a very weird chapter. I think it's super interesting. I think the stake is a figure of Buddhist contemplation, the eyes of which are gone, but that nevertheless are indicated. It's an eye that, unlike the one staring at it, yields no reflection. It is a non-reflective eye that nevertheless seems to be looking back at you. And don't forget, the object of the scopic drive is, technically speaking, the gaze. And that is not the position from which you look. It is the position from which you are seen. The gaze, according to Lacan, are all of the positions in the room in which you find yourself from which someone or something can see you. He recalls in one of his seminars being on a fishing boat when he was trying to get some cash together. And one of the rather drunken fishermen says, "Do you see that can over there in the water?" And Lacan says, "No, I don't." And the fisherman says, "Well, it sees you." And then they all laugh. I still don't get if that's a joke or what the deal is. But Lacan says, this is seminar 11, by the way. This is the one after this one. He says, yeah, this is exactly what the gaze is. It's the position from which you can be seen, which is why in great feminist and cinematographic terms, you can get this internalization of the Lacanian notion of the gaze in terms of male erotic gaze that women have internalized in the Western tradition. Such that when woman stands in front of the mirror, she's not looking at herself from her own point of view, but from the viewpoint of a more or less turned on male. So we've heard about this. Laura Mulvey, the feminists after Lacan, made a great deal of the gaze. It's the position from which you're seen, and it can be assigned to the painting on the wall in front of you. It's the little glowing red or green light on your laptop indicating that your camera is now on. It is your laptop itself. It has the gaze. Within that broad discussion of the gaze, Lacan wants to talk very particularly about the type of gaze that you get from a smudge on the mirror that does not reflect something back to you. It does occupy the gaze, but it's staring back at you in a way that is rather disturbing. Disturbing technically because it disturbs the otherwise whole image of you, the specular image. And we can draw that little I next to little a in parens. That's the Lacanian algebra for the specular image. If you strip away the little I and pull the parens out, you know what letter's left. It's little a. What stares back at you from the stain or the smudge or the spittle or the particle of food attached to your mirror is objet.
May I, sorry, just in my understanding, what you're describing, the gaze from which you're seen, is more like a Foucauldian panoptic gaze that would be similar to the cinematic gaze, male gaze on a female. But I remember reading Lacan, and he sounds like at some point, I forgot which book it was, that he was saying that the gaze is a which that does not see you, but not that which that sees you. And I was just doing a quick Googling of Lacan. It was a story written 1964. I forgot which book it is, but basically it's the exact story you were mentioning. The quote says, "The young fisherman says to Lacan, Do you see that box? Do you see it? Well, it doesn't see you. So does the gaze see you or it doesn't see you for Lacan?
The stake here is one that occupies a position from which you can be seen. The question is not whether that piece of food that popped out of your mouth while you were flossing and is stuck to the mirror has eyes and is staring back at you. The question is how it disturbs and troubles the otherwise seamless relationship between the spectator and the speculum, between the person in front of the mirror and the mirror itself. It troubles that otherwise stadium of reflections. It calls it into question. It's something that sticks out in a way that troubles the situation. That's why I use the word disturb.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the gaze doesn't see you. Can I use it to describe Chinese government who represses the people in lockdown and ignores their call?
Yeah, you can use it to you can use a lot of things to describe the Chinese government. I don't know if this fits. Yeah, but the gaze is typically, and notice how I'm saying this, a position from which you can be seen. So it doesn't mean that the plant across the room from you has eyes and is staring back at you. It means that that is one position from which somebody, if they were to remove that plant, could sit in a chair and stare back at you. And that's enough to do the kind of work. I don't know if this is where you're going by bringing up Foucault's panopticon, but it is certainly suggestive there, right? What people figured out in the 19th century was that a mirror here or there keeps subjects way more in line than an actual guard with a club, because it's the work of being watched that allows for self-discipline. So this is how you get the prison tower, according to Foucault, right? You don't even have to have a guard in that thing. You just put a tower up, put some mirrors around it, and the assumption made by the prisoners is that they are being watched. And they err on the side of behaving as a result. That's the notion of the panopticon. You have elementary schools that are still designed this way as well. Anybody who has attended lectures at San Francisco State, you'll know that many of the classrooms have a mirrored wall in the back. And that's so social scientists can be back there studying subjects doing whatever it is that they do. Now, some rooms in San Francisco State also have curtains that you pull in front of those mirrors, because students show up and they're like, what the fuck is there a mirror doing here? Who's back there? Why are they watching me? I don't know if I'm telling you to go ahead and steal from Walmart because there is no camera behind those black bubbles attached to the ceiling. But the fact that the bubbles are there is usually enough to deter people. And I know this all the time living in San Francisco, because I know people who simply bought a non-working outdoor camera and attached it to their garage so that it looks like there's a working camera, and it comes with a sign that says this property is under 24-hour surveillance. That camera, if you just look at it, you can look at the camera, there's a wire hanging from it. It's not plugged into anything. So that's partly how the gaze can work. Whether the camera is flipped on or not, it is suggestive of being watched. And that's enough. Really, though, for Lacan, though, remember, it's this body part. I keep coming back to the image of a piece of food that is popped out of your teeth while you floss and gets stuck to the mirror. It now renders that section of the mirror unreflective, and it also marks a part of you, a body part. Remember, object A is a real body part from the mythical subject that can't be metabolized by the symbolic. And it's one that calls into question the otherwise pristine existence that you have in your super clean bathroom as you clean your super clean teeth under super crystal 3000 luminescent lights that make you look this, that, and the other. You know what I'm saying? It disrupts the illusion of perfection and coherence and really beauty, which is why Lacan introduces this concept with the notion of the beauty mark, which he then immediately transforms into the stain. That's part of what he's getting at here. He's really working hard here, really as hard as I've seen him work. He's working extremely hard here to try and bring us to this very odd, enigmatic object that is not an object. So it has a gaze, but that doesn't mean that it's watching you. He's working really hard to try and gather this stuff up. Object A is not exactly an object out in the world. It's an opening. Remember what I said last time. The object of the desirous other's pursuit is the opening in which I might pursue my own desire. That's why Lacan says anxiety is not without an object. It doesn't mean it has one in the normal sense. The object of anxiety is an opening. And little a is just his choice of algebraic symbols to signal this opening, this cut or rupture in an otherwise pretty clear fabric. That's why the stain on the mirror comes up. That's why the eyes that are there and indicative of vision but aren't there are relevant here as well. They're eyes that not only don't look back at you, but they're eyes that also don't reflect, other than the surface of polished wood. Dead eyes. Dead eyes can still reflect the world around them. Ask Neil Young. Dead eyes can reflect the world around them, even if they can't look back at you. That's why it's so freaky when you walk by a dead creature and you look down and it looks like they're staring at you. Or if you, this is a classic trope in films as well. Or where in comedy, the version of this is where the subject starts to speak to somebody in the film and their eyes are open and all of a sudden they let out a snore. And it turns out they're asleep, they sleep with their eyes open. But the subject doesn't realize that and is carrying on a conversation with them. Because the eye is open, it serves the purpose of that mirror, but it doesn't mean that eye is looking. On the contrary, that eye is unconscious.
Have you seen that movie, The Tenant, Roman Polanski?
Whenever somebody asks me if I've seen a movie, I just always say I don't think so. Even if I know I have. I think I have found it's just a safer way to proceed. So I don't think so.
It's very creepy. And it's something to do with people around him turning into the other that doesn't see him. Anyway, we don't need to get in it, but it's a horror movie.
Okay, we have horror movies lined up, and this is one of them. Thank you. We have work to do, but I want to make sure we get some more questions answered.
I have a question, Sam.
Go ahead.
So is the purpose of the analyst to be placed or to be seen as object A by the analysand? So does that cause transference?
What it does is it awakens desire. And so if you look in seminar 17 in the 4 discourses, and you look at the discourse of the analyst, you can see that the position of the subject, the position of the speaker, the analyst's position, is designated with little a. And I believe that what Lacan is suggesting there is that a good analyst is a jump starter for the analysand's desire. And the first move is, at some level, to make the analysand curious about the analyst. Now, I'm using the word curious and not anxious, but it could be as simple, and for those of you that work with patients, I'm sure you've seen this, where the analysand is sitting across from you and looking at you as if to say, what do you want from me? Oh, I know what you're thinking. Or, here's what's up with me. Okay, now give me an answer. You're supposed to know everything, but in a way that is reserved and held back in a way that piques the interest of the analysand. Now, I think that part of the artistry of what would happen in the room, and I'm no practicing Lacanian, so we'd have to ask one, is the ability to show up in the place of object A, awaken the curiosity of the patient about you as an analyst, and then over time, redirect that curiosity back at themselves, so that now the analysand becomes curious about themselves. Why am I here? What am I up to? What's going on with me? And I think that's part of the artistry of being a Lacanian analyst, is to awaken the subject desire and then redirect that desire back at them. At least that's what I've heard. And I think if you read some of Bruce Fink's work, The Clinical Introduction to Lacan, you can see him spelling out some of this as well, this kind of delicate dance of redirecting desire. Now, what's important also is not just the position of the analyst, but the position that the analyst's discourse imposes on the analysand. The analysand sometimes will show up and want to play master. I know what's wrong with me. I'm here because I'm anxious, and I need you to help me figure out X, Y, and Z. They may even show up with a list of things that they want you to address. They want to show up and play master. A good Lacanian analyst, though, speaks to them not like they're masters, but like they're hysterics. And I don't want to get too bogged down in the clinical substructure of neurosis known as hysteria, because what Lacan is here suggesting is that the analyst, by playing object A, is going to speak in a way that addresses the analysand like they're a split subject. He's not going to speak to them as though they are a whole, coherent, masterful being. In other words, he's not going to address their ego. Instead, he's going to address the parts of them that feel insecure, uncertain, a little bit, I don't know, I can't really explain it. So Bruce Fink has an example of a patient who shows up and says, I was watching this movie the other night. It was called The Tenant. And there's this character in there who's acting, I don't know, anyway, they're in a relationship and this character is treating their partner badly. And I really got pissed off because that's not the kind of relationship I want to be in. And Bruce says that he's tempted in this moment. He says the temptation is to immediately jump on this expression of desire and ask the patient, well, what kind of relationship do you desire for yourself? Let's talk about what you might actually want for yourself. Incorrect. That was a trap. The better move is instead to talk about the feeling of repulsion and disgust that the person felt towards the person in the film that they don't want as their significant other. What was it about them that got you so upset? Because that is not speaking to the desire of the ego, but to the jouissance of the unconscious. What you are doing in that moment is you're saying, aha, I just found something in your life that gets you hot, that riles you up, that troubles you. Isn't that interesting? Look at how alive you just were in that moment. And now we're on the path of Lacanian psychoanalysis, not pursuing the parts of the subject that seem coherent, in the sense of, that's not the kind of relationship I want. Honey, the kind of relationship that I want looks like blah, blah, blah. And you're going to have to forgive me because I'm in the middle of watching the assassination of Gianni Versace and working through this character, this sociopathic character of Andrew Cunanan. Oh my gosh. And all the things that he wants in this elaborate facade that is his sense of self, that everyone seems ready to see through. Because behind that facade is a split subject. And so the question here is not just what position does the analyst occupy, but to what position do they speak? They speak at the part of the subject that is not on display, that is not polished. In fact, They speak at the part of the subject that all of the display and polish are designed to conceal. That part of them that feels split, insecure, out of control. The same way they felt a little out of control in their rage toward this person in the film. That position is that of a split subject, which is why if you look at the discourse of the analyst in seminar 17, it's little a speaking at barred S. You awaken their desire and speak to them in a way that highlights their cracks. Not in a mean way, but in a way that calls that out. Now, when I say speak to the crack, I want you to notice what I'm pointing to as the object. The object is not the split subject. It's that which splits them. It is the split itself. And so tonight is going to be a night of elaborate math equations. Here's the first one. If you want to understand the split subject, you have to understand this. 1 + 1 = 3. And you know why it equals 3, right? Because object A is the minimum distance, irreducible, between 2 points that allow those points to remain distinct. In the split subject, you don't just have a bioanimalistic self and a sociolinguistic self that are in tension with each other. No, what you have are all of these gaps between the 2 parts of your subjectivity. Those openings, represented by the bar that goes through the letter S, are a third element. But the reason why we forget that 1 + 1 = 3 is because that third element is not an element like the rest. It's not a thing, it's not a part. It's an opening. It's a fissure, it's a rupture, it's an irreducible distance, however slight. You see, the question of sexuality is oftentimes, how close can I put these 2 bodies together? How close can I imbricate these bodies? Yours inside of mine and mine inside of yours. Lacan's point is not that you become one in those moments, but that your relationship becomes one of thirdness instead. Because what's on display at that point are all of your cracks, of course, but primarily the split between you and the other person. 2 bodies pressed together are always still 2 bodies, no matter how close or one they feel. That's going to be Lacan's point. So the first math equation for us tonight is 1 + 1 = 3. And that third element that you add to it is, you can call it the plus sign. You can call it the equation itself. But for us, I think it's good to talk about it as the minimum distance required to have one and another together. This is them kissing. Couldn't resist. We have a formal question before we dive into material. Go ahead, Ira.
Can you relate this to analysis, please? My understanding was that the analyst shows up as the big other, l'autre, and what you were referring to earlier, the sujet supposé savoir, that the analysand comes in believing that the analyst knows more about him or her than she does, and the end of analysis, a successful analysis, in my understanding, is when the analysand realizes that the analyst doesn't know more.
That's a very good way to put it. I've heard it put many different ways of how analysis ends. The position you're describing is indeed the one I was alluding to. In English, it's translated usually as the subject supposed to know.
But hold on, let me ask you. This is something that came to my mind 1 second ago. This is really interesting to me. Sujet supposé savoir. Like, why wouldn't it be l'objet supposé savoir? Why does the analysand see the analyst as a subject rather than an object?
Ooh, good question. I don't know. I mean, you could run it a couple different ways and come out with a pretty clean answer. Maybe it's because deep down, the inverse of that statement, which is to say its truest component, is that the analysand views themselves as an object.
That's very interesting.
And they know they're the piece of shit, which is why they have to treat you, dear clinician, as the slave. Get to work. Give me your knowledge. I'm paying for this. You might even have had a patient show up and be like, yeah, you know what? I'm the boss. You're fired. I'm paying for this. So tell me what's up. Oh, you're just going to sit there and just take notes and not say anything? Come on, man. Get to work. I don't know how this works, but I've heard horror stories. It just sounds awful. I can't even believe that then you would end a session and 5 minutes later have some other asshole come into your office and try to do the same thing for like 8 hours. I can't even imagine that. You all are saints. You are miracle workers to be able to like process all that. But yeah, the subject supposed to know. It's a great question of why that would be a subject and not an object. But usually when you have addressees being designated and called out, you can usually invert the positionality that is being assigned to them and read it back into the addressor, to the person speaking. So if I call you an asshole and we're in therapy, it's probably because I feel like I'm the asshole. Or maybe, the inverse of whatever an asshole is. So it might be that I'm trying to perform as being a really nice person, and so you have to be the asshole. But you get into this dialectic that's pretty useful I believe. But part of that dialectic is the analysand showing up and assuming that you're the one who's supposed to have all the answers. You are the subject, even though you probably should be an object because you're certainly being treated as one. You're the commodity supposed to know. And that's a troubling place to be, because if you will look at the graph where Lacan is working out the discourse of the analyst, and let me go ahead and share the screen so you all can see this. The discourse of the analyst, here's your little a, that's the position of the speaker. Here's the subject that they are addressing. Then there's this position of truth. If you know seminar 17, in the position of truth, in the discourse of the analyst in seminar 17, you have this figure, which is knowledge. This is usually the position of something that is hidden. Usually from this person. This person can't quite see what's underneath them. This is their truth. This is where they speak from. This is who they speak to. This is what they ask the person to produce. But this is the truth of the speaker's position. And I bring this up here not to take us too far afield, but to just remind those of you that have studied 17 that in the position of truth, the hidden position for the analyst is knowledge. So when the analysand shows up and treats the therapist as the subject supposed to know, they are tempting them to trot out all their knowledge, tempting them, in other words, to change positions. And instead of speaking in response from position object A, if the analyst succumbs to this, they will then speak from the position of knowledge. And this puts them in a totally different discourse. In fact, it's gathered by just a simple quarter turn, where each of the 4 positions here simply moves down one. If you look at this, you can see. So S2 pops up, little a shifts over, split subject drops down. Whoops, hold on a second. And this would be S1. Just 1 minute, and then I'll explain it here. Now, what's happening in this moment is the analyst has given in to playing a different role now, which is not that of the analyst, but instead that of the professor. Or as Lacan refers to it, the university. This is the university discourse. So when that happens, Ira, if the analyst responds in a way that says, well, actually, it doesn't sound like you have anxiety at all, dear sir. In fact, I've got some better ideas of what it is that might be bothering you. In that case, they're now no longer speaking from the position of object A, and thus no longer able to incite the desire or to mobilize the desire of the analysand. But now they're speaking from the position of a professor talking to a student, trying to pique their curiosity and allow them to feel inadequate, all the while neglecting the fact that they are in fact doing the work of the master. This is the truth of the university, according to Lacan, is that professors don't realize when they're dropping all kinds of knowledge and scandalizing students that they're just the mouthpiece for power. And this is the great insight that Marx had long before Lacan. The ruling ideas in any given era are always the ideas of the ruling class in that era. And the professor, all too often, has been the mouthpiece for whatever is the ruling ideas. So anyway, you don't want to be that as an analyst, I guess is the moral of this story.
Okay, one last question. When you made the symbol of the fingers, and what would the analyst's goal be in terms of I don't know, the reconciling or the space between the animal desires and the regulations against those primal desires?
I don't think that there's a search for reconciliation here. I haven't ever seen that in writings from Lacan.
Okay, let me just go back and then in terms of what you said in the cracks between the two, what would the analyst's goal be?
Maybe just to increase some awareness of that. And I would say ultimately to allow the analysand to be cool with it. If you ask me after these years of studying Lacan and thinking about what this is about as a clinical practice, I'm no clinician, but my understanding of the end of analysis for Lacan looks a lot like somebody who has completed some significant coursework on self-compassion. They recognize that they are imperfect, and they're cool with that.
Let me. It's in terms of
happens as a result of that is that they now have a capacity to love, not just love themselves, but to love others. So that, in my view, is the horizon, whether you're in analysis or not, of reading Lacan, is coming to terms, right? It's the talking cure, coming to terms with the parts of you that feel inadequate, incomplete, accepting those parts, even loving them, even picking the worst part of your life and thanking the perpetrator. That's how extreme some of these thoughts go. Because if that horrible shit hadn't happened to you all those years ago, you wouldn't be the person you are today. And the person you are today is pretty damn solid. It's kind of a good person. I kind of like that person, and you should too. And as a result, don't have regrets. Don't wish things would be different. All of your flaws, all this stuff, it would be about accepting those. And it would be about having a sense of compassion towards oneself when you fuck up. You're only human. Nobody's perfect. People make mistakes. And as a result, being able to extend that acceptance of your own lack to another person, which is to say, to allow them to fuck up, to allow them to have a horrible past. You ever been in a relationship where someone is kind of like holding you hostage to previous people you've had sex with? Like before you met them, they're like looking down their nose at you because you happen to fuck somebody else before you met them. Like, huh? What are you talking about? That's not the same as me cheating on you, fool. That's not what that is. Because I had sex with somebody 10 years ago doesn't mean that I had an affair. Are you tripping? That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. It would be about this kind of radical acceptance that Lacan defines as love. giving what you don't have. And the reason why people add to someone who probably doesn't want it is because what you're doing in that moment is you're embracing the parts of a person that their ego can't come to terms with, that they won't accept, that they keep shoving aside. This is what I would think would be a horizon, Ira, for working through the Lacanian tradition. Now, I can't speak to this again in a clinical context, but I think it does carry over into everyday life. Reading Lacan would have this as an effect if done well.
What I thought you were going to go to was awareness of the split, of being a split subject.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great too. But it would be an awareness that doesn't say, I'm 1 + 1 and thus twofold. It would be a 1 + 1 that yields an endless count and recount, a tale, if you will. Don't forget, the origin of the word tell and count or tally, they come from the same word. To tell a tale is oftentimes to recount one. There's a sense in which the coming to terms, the narration of one's history, where the past is no longer something that determines your life, but something that you now have owned and claimed as your past, known as history. This kind of retelling is also a recounting. And the math is fuzzy here. So this self-awareness, Ira, would be 1 + 1 = 3. That's me. I'm 1 + 1 = 3. At the very least. And the count would continue from there. Now, I've got things I came here to say. I came here to say some things to you all. And I realize at this point, our 5th session together, that we could just keep on going in this direction. And hell, maybe that would be good enough. But damn if I wouldn't feel remiss. I came here to put you all through some paces and to draw some beautiful pictures on a blackboard. The whiteboard is what I do in person. The blackboard is what I do virtually. But first, I want to review some stuff. I want to walk us through the 3 basic steps that we've got here. If you want like a Lacanian ontology, this is it. And I'm going to present these things in a way that are sequential. But bear in mind that each step is retroactively constituted by the one that follows. So it's not that 1 begets 2. It's that as soon as you have the number 2, you start imagining what 1 must have been. Remember that as we get going. So first things first, where we started here was with this subject of pure need. Not just tonight, but with all of our sessions so far. This is a mythical, a priori, presupposed being in what Lacan calls the here and now of the all in the process of becoming. Don't forget, that's also what's popping in the chapter on Buddha's eyelids. It's not just about ones and zeros. It's about the all and nothing. The all in question here is this bioanimalistic state that the subject of pure need occupies. The representation that we have of that state is just a simple delta, a triangle. I'm going to share my screen again so we can start throwing up some of these images. The subject of pure need is represented by a simple triangle. You also see it in Lacan represented in these tables as an S. This is the subject of pure need. What comes next is the imaginary. Here we talk about it in a different triangle, the pre-Oedipal triangle that we were working with, that looks something like this, where you have the child here, you had the maternal function up here, and then you had this object in the corner, the imaginary phallus. So the next object for us is this imaginary phallus. This is a pre-Oedipal triangle that is ruled by the child's relationship to mother's desire. The child has a desire for the mother, realizes mom has other interests, and then tries to identify with those things in order to get the maternal function directed at it, in order to secure, in other words, and satisfy the child's desire for the mother. This next step is imaginary. It's not mythical, it's imaginary. And it's represented for us by the imaginary object here, Greek phi. Next, from imaginary triangles to symbolic squares. This is the point at which the paternal function shows up and cuts a line through here, introducing a fourth element, making this a square. The symbol here is of the imaginary phallus removed. So here is our mythical, here is our imaginary, and here is our symbolic. This is a properly Oedipal experience, not the pre-Oedipal triangle of the imaginary, but the Oedipal square of the symbolic. What happens in this moment, as you know, is that the name or the no of the father cuts in, denies everyone access to this object, saying that the mother doesn't have it and the kid can't be it for her. In other words, subtracting this element from the equation. And in its place, some space emerges, an opening between the devouring desire of the mother and the child, who now has some breathing room in which to cultivate a desire of their own. This process, where the no of the father introduces some breathing room or a cut, is known as castration. You'll oftentimes hear it referred to as alienation as well. It is represented by parens minus phi for our purposes. The next term is the signifier for lack in Lacanian algebra. It's the lack that becomes the cause of the child's desire. You see, once the maternal function's desire has been cut and set aside, introducing some breathing room for the child, that's a gap or an opening, some breathing room in which the child, the symbol we have for that is A. A is the symbol for lack that we have that comes to mark this void space. It is a sign of lack. And little a is how we figure or symbolize this lack. It's the lack that is the cause, or you might even think of it as the opportunity, or as I've referred to it tonight, the opening for the child's desire. So far our trajectory looks like this. There's a subject of pure need, then you have this imaginary triangle, then the imaginary triangle has to account for a symbolic cut or a rupture. Then we get this fourth term that allows us to designate this open space. What I want to do now is call out this element. Lacan refers to this on several occasions in our readings for tonight. Maybe you caught this too, as the 0 point. Pages 242, 253, 254, it's all over this. And there's zero talk elsewhere too. Pages 25, 104, 329, we'll get there eventually. There's a lot about zeros happening in this seminar. To identify little a as the 0 point is to do something very interesting. Something that in our case is going to require a new color, and with it, another really complicated math equation. 1 minus 1 equals, and this time there's no trick to it, 0. Now let's replace these elements with the terms that we have. Here it is. This is what Lacan is up to when he refers to little a as a 0 point. What is the number 0 but a signifier for nothing? A signifier for that marks a place where nothing is. It is a figure of lack. It is the algebraic term, like the number 0, that indicates a place in the symbolic where nothing shows up. And I like that. Nothing shows up there. In every sense of the phrase, this little a designates the point in the symbolic where nothing shows up. I guess I'll go ahead and save this just in case, but I'm ready to move on to the next step in this analysis. First, questions real quick before we jump on to the next phase. All right, then let's recall where we've been. Now, I'm not going to slow down. I'm going to keep moving fast here, knowing that all of this is recorded and you can always go back and see what's being said. What I've given you here, and to my knowledge, it's been given nowhere else, is a formula for anxiety. The desire of a lacking other greater than the cause of the desire of the split subject. Now, what I want to focus on here is this little a again. Lacan refers to this moment sometimes, only once that I can find in here, as a coincidence without merger of 2 points. First, the anxiety point. And second, the point of desire.
Hey, Sam, I can't see what you're writing. Because someone put on some weird.
You can see what I'm writing.
I can't see it.
Hands
either.
up if you can see what I'm writing. Okay, so nobody can see what I'm writing here? All right, hold up.
Somebody put on some kind of weird.
No, it's just
background.
someone put on together mode. So what y'all have to do is go to view in the top right-hand corner and change it back to grid. And then you can see Sam's screen.
Yeah, so upper right-hand corner, go to view. Did that work? Hold on, let me stop sharing and then I'll come back to it real quick and see if that helps. Okay, so now does everyone just see us again? All right. So now let's go to share screen again. How's it looking, y'all? If I go to grid view, can you all see? Are we good?
Yes.
All right, great, thank you. So what we're working on here is this little a. And what Lacan is suggesting here is that it's the anxiety point, but it also, at some level, serves as a point of desire. Yeah, what is it? Is there another technical issue? What's up, y'all? I thought I heard a chirp or something. All right, thumbs up if you can see the screen in black again, just to make sure we're all good. Thumbs up, please.
We can
Nobody-
see your Skype window.
What does that mean? You can see my Skype window?
Yeah, if you go back to the black screen, we can see the black screen. Now we can see it.
So you can see whatever it is that I am hovering over.
Yeah.
All right, got it. Thank you, Oliver. So damn helpful, damn. Okay. So what we have here then is this formula for anxiety, and we have a finer tuned analysis emerging of this little a. And what I want to know is, if it's true, as Lacan claims on page 242, that this little a, as the 0 point, can be a coincidence without merger of these two elements, the origin of desire and the object of anxiety. How are we to understand this? How can little a be both of these things at once? One way that we can start to get some answers to this question, and here y'all, I'm going to move on to another drawing, and one that you've seen before, is to get us back to this table that Lacan is messing with throughout the middle portion of this book. And I drew it for you last time. It looked something like this. Recognize this one? And he puts jouissance over here, corresponding to the upper level. He puts anxiety here, and then desire below. And what I was telling you last time is the way to understand the progression of this table, because it does have some movement built into it, is to notice the circle that occurs here. You start at this point with the subject of pure need, passes over and through the big other, and as a product of this, you get these two elements, which result in desire and fantasy. But notice how Lacan's got this set up. Anxiety occupies this median point between the two. This is what we've been trying to understand. He leaves us with this, and then somewhere in our readings, he shifts to talking about moms and babies. He shifts to talking about uterine experience. And here what I want to do is map this onto these three levels with a series of circles that I think might help us understand what he's up to. Really more like oddly shaped donuts. This is the experience Lacan is referring to when he talks about the uterine experience in Seminar 10. Here is the maternal organism, the mama to be. Here is the baby, the individual to be, and then here this element in between is the mammalian component, represented for Lacan here by the placenta. The baby is connected to the placenta, is connected to the uterine wall of the mom. Now, this is corresponding with the upper level. It is a mythical level. Now, we all know this is anatomically true. What we want to get at is what happens next. The next thing that happens in this process is an opening for desire, which Lacan would have us draw as such. He says there's a first cut. That results in a split subject. The mama is still here, and so also is her attachment to the mama, the placenta in this case. What is emerging in this moment is what Lacan calls the desire point. The anatomical example he's working with here is a rather normal birth where the baby pops out, and then a little while later, you know what happens next. The placenta is delivered, It's a second delivery. But what comes first, after you have this holistic experience, so to speak, is a severance of the baby from the maternal organism. Interestingly, Lacan refers to this process as separtition, not separation, separtition. On page 237, it's a partition on the inside, he says, in a way that is internal to the child's existence. This is the emergence of a partial object. In the oral drive, this is going to become the breast. This is the part of the mom that belongs to her that the child longs for. This is the partial object. It's the partial object that will awaken desire. It's the partial object, depending on your drive, around which you will later circulate in life. So it's interesting to think of A as the opening here, but as a partial object, it also can work here. But this space in between is the desire point. Now that we've got some of these terms, I want to talk about what happens in anxiety, using the exact same structures that we were just messing with. When anxiety occurs, there is a second cut, according to Lacan. In which the maternal organism is no longer whole or coherent, but shown to be lacking just as much. Here we see the emergence of anxiety point. And now you've got a proper configuration where you have little a here in the middle, marking the space. And on one side of it, you've got the anxiety point. On the other side of it, you've got the desire point. This is that coincidence without merger that Lacan is talking about. Now, if you go back down to this desire element, the child is born, the placenta drops out, the child's unaware of this, whatever, but the child does become aware of the maternal breast. Just keeping it very traditional. That becomes an object of desire, a desire for nourishment, a desire for food, not just because it keeps you alive, right, as a subject of pure need, but also because it just feels good. And this is a trick that a lot of nursing moms deal with. When is the baby just there chewing on the breast, and when are they actually feeding? Sometimes the kid falls asleep. Other times the mother will say things like, you know what, this kid's not hungry. They just like nursing. They just like being there on mother's breast. That is a desire to be close to mom, to close this gap. When anxiety occurs, it's something different. Mother is no longer seen as a feeder, as a provider of nourishment who is full of milk, but instead, somebody who lacks, in this case, milk. This is anxiety, fundamentally, Lacan says, about the breast drying up. Anxiety at the oral phase is about a breast, quotation marks around breast, drying up, the glass going empty. Or better yet, the bar running out of beer, because that would be the big other who is now shown as lacking. There are lots of examples of this. What I want to suggest, though, is that we see a very interesting move that is occurring here. From the imaginary to castration, to desire, to fantasy. At the level of desire here, it's a coherent move. which we might be able to represent like this. At the level of anxiety, we see something totally different. We see this little a being forced to account for itself in a different way. This mark, as we know from our work with the symbolic square, is the mark of castration. It's not the mark of lack, but of castration, the predecessor to lack. In anxiety, a big other who themselves is lacking shows up and doesn't just demand and close out the opening in which you might pursue your desire. They show up and demand that you show up as castrated. Show me, prove it. This is precisely what Lacan is working at on page 46 and why we spent some time working on this part. I think it's important to hold in mind this shift from the subtracted phallus to little a in desire, which is that trajectory that we were working on that looked like this, don't forget. I'm not stepping too far away from this here, y'all. This is the entire ontology. Subject of pure need, imaginary triangle, symbolic square, the opening of lack that in turn becomes the cause for the desire of a split subject. An extension, if you want to go further, the mobilization of desire at the level of fantasy, a split subject in relation to their A. That'd be the next step here. What's happening in the field of anxiety is a reversal where the subject, the desiring subject, is not just being marched back to their lack, but being marched back one step further to their castration. This is why Lacan, again, and those famous pages, some of the best pages I think so far in this seminar, 45 and 46. 46, what the neurotic shrinks back from is not castration, but from turning his castration into what the other lacks. He shrinks back from turning his castration into something positive, namely the guarantee of the function of the other. This is important because castration is experienced by the subject as a negative. It is a taking away, a subtractive, prohibitive no that we've spoken so much about. When anxiety strikes, that negation that produces the opening for the subject to pursue their desire is positivized. It becomes the object of the other's desire and says, give it to me. I want that. Show me that you've undergone it. Show me that you're castrated. And you can scroll down on 46 and see this playing out. This can only ensure for himself by a means of a signifier, and the signifier is necessarily missing. The subject is summoned in anxiety to this missing place to tender the exact change in the shape of a sign, the sign of his own castration. The sign of the subject's castration is this. When anxiety happens, hear me now, the opening in which the subject used to cultivate their desire is being marched back to the point of castration that first cut, that opened up that place for the subject to move into. That is how I read what Lacan is saying here about the anxiety point and the point of desire coinciding at times, but not in ways that allow them to merge. Which raises a really key question for us. What's left after anxiety? What can you do after anxiety? Well, note our table here. If this arrow is an accurate description, what comes after desire is anxiety, and what comes after anxiety is jouissance. Not the mythical J0 of the subject of pure need, which is why we put jouissance in quotation marks here. Lacan is very clear that if we can even use the word jouissance to describe this uteroific experience, which we really can't. Technically, that's an error. We can't actually use the word jouissance to describe this mythical presupposed state of oneness. We can just call it J0 because that shit don't exist. Now, bear in mind what you already know about 0 too as I say that. Point 3 here is like J1. It's a different kind of jouissance. What I want to suggest here before we take a little break is that what's left to do after anxiety is to reclaim jouissance. And I use the word reclaim here very hesitantly because it's not like jouissance was once had and lost and now we're regaining it. Anxiety, though, tills the soil for jouissance. On the other side of anxiety, what I want to suggest is not more desire, but instead enjoyment. Desire is the prey of anxiety. Anxiety preys on the desire of the subject. What, however, the death of anxiety turns up, the soil that it tills for the subject is that of enjoyment. The other side of anxiety is a kind of jouissance that is accessed by the partial satisfaction of desire in the drive. This is the uppermost return arrow of the graph of desire, which passes from the drive you can see it on page 4 yourself, which occurs in a field of castration all the way back over to jouissance. This trajectory from desire to anxiety to jouissance is also, I believe, on display at the uppermost arc in the graph of desire. Now that's a lot, and we're going to unpack some more of this as we go. But for right now, I want to take a pause. We're at 7:35, which means we're halfway through tonight's work. Let's take 10, everybody, and come on back here at about 7:48. Okay, we are officially on break. Come back at 7:48, and we'll be ready to answer questions and take a few more steps. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I realized that last stretch was a bit of a blitz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to sharing screen. And with any amount of luck, you should be able to see where we just were. And please know that I'm happy to explain anything here further. And I'm also happy to trot out some illustrations, one of which is actually pretty disturbing, but I've been saving it all week for you. So looking at this imagery here of yellow, green, and blue, what questions do you have? Or what points would you like me to rehearse or explain more? And again, just remember that we can go back through this in the recording too, if that's going to be easier. Well, let's first then talk about this anxiety thing. And I want to hit you with that disturbing example, which I remembered the other night. I was hanging out with a family, and the mother of the two daughters in the household told them, can you all hear me okay? I want to make sure I only have to say this once. All right, cool, thank you. She told them in front of others, think of me as the tuna can bobbing along in the sea. The tuna can that can't see me but is nevertheless looking. She says to her children, I used to have great tits until you sucked them off. Now don't get caught up in the verbiage of things being sucked off, but focus on what we're doing here at the level of anxiety. If the anxiety point in the case of the oral drive would be not a desire to be fed by a full other, and that's important to note here. The mama in question at this point is taken to be a very full other, in this case, full of milk. At the level of anxiety, I told you, this is anxiety about the breast potentially drying up. In other words, there not being a lot of milk there. In this case, the mother would pass from being a full feeder to a lacking and thus desirous being. That's why we go from an unbarred A here to a barred A. The mother is now seen to be lacking, represented in the graph of desire by this element, a signifier of mother's lack. And that was pretty much what this lady trotted out, was that she used to have great tits and thus be an object of desire and a sexual being, presumably in exchange, until these little desirous beings showed up and drained her, sucked her tits off. Here, the child's dependence on the mother for sustenance is targeted, called out, signaled, and addressed, kicked back to the child, and called for a response. Account for the fact that it was your lack that left me with mine. You see how this is working? Here is our child. Here is the lack in them that is bigger for a partial object here known as the breast. And here is this parent who just showed up and said, I want this back. That's mine. I used to have them and now I don't have it anymore. And as a result, I lack. Give it back to me. I think this is what Lacan is getting at as he ramps up to the drives, specifically the oral drive, with this discussion of mammalian existence early on. So you can think of nursing as the basic oral drive here, a desire for sustenance, a desire for the breast. And then did you notice this move where Lacan turns from the nursing child to the vampire? What is vampirism? An anxious fantasy or image of the breast drying up and of the oral drive passing from a desire for self-nourishment and comfort and care at the level of nursing to the very destruction of the being that would otherwise keep it alive. Vampirism passing from sucking the milk out of a full other who can produce more later to keep the child alive, to sucking the warm, vital source of this very being's nourishment, not the nourishment of the child, but the nourishment of the mother. The vampire is a figure of anxiety because it suggests that once the milk runs out, blood is going to follow. And once the sucking passes from milk to blood, eventually, the mom is not just going to be lacking in milk. She herself is going to die. She will not just be drained of milk, but she will be drained of life itself. You can see Lacan working this out in the 230s. Pages 236 and 238, in fact, are the key passages here. The one on 238 deserves some special attention from us. So flip with me, if you will, to 238. Now, I just flipped back over to this screen. Do you still see the blackboard in front of you, or do you now see me and the rest of us?
I see the Skype window now.
Okay, great. That's totally fine, as long as you can hear me and we can work through this together. So 236 was one I called out. This is where vampirism is first brought up. But 238 is the one I want to call your attention to. I'd say it's probably a dozen lines up from the bottom on 238. The passage begins likewise. I haven't brought up the phantasmatic image of the vampire just for the sake of it. Do you see that? Yeah. The vampire is not dreamt of in the human imagination in any other way than as a mode of fusing or initial subtraction at the very life force where the assailing subject can find, and here's the key point, the wellhead of his jouissance. When I'm working through this table and telling you that after desire comes anxiety and after anxiety comes jouissance, this is one of the passages that I'm vamping on, if you will. This move from the full other loaded with milk to the lacking other, not only devoid of milk, but eventually to be drained of life itself, that's how significant the lack in the big other here is, opens the door to something. In fact, notice the use of word here, wellhead. I don't have the French in front of me, but I kind of wonder what is meant by wellhead. Is this like the start of some kind of river? Is this the origin of the Mississippi, somewhere deep in Minnesota? Is this the beginning of the flow, of a different flow? If it is not the flow of desire and it is not the flow of anxiety. This is the wellhead of jouissance. At the outer reaches of anxiety, when the big other has been drained, not only of what it was we once desired from it, but from what it also depends on for its own existence, we now have the source of another stream of experience. And that experience is enjoyment. This is where I'm getting this turn towards jouissance, not just from a careful reading of the table that he's been developing throughout this seminar, but also of the progression that this table suggests. The reading of this table suggests that you will be passing from desire to anxiety, and then on the return circuit to jouissance. This is how we start getting to that jouissance, something on the other side of anxiety. You'll also note on the following page, 239, Lacan doubles down. First full paragraph. This is what allows us to justify what the clinic shows us very frequently. And now I'm not a clinician, but if this is what you all are seeing when you work with patients, damn, I must be in the wrong line of work. Namely, the fundamental equivalence between orgasm and at least certain forms of anxiety. The possibility of an orgasm occurring at the height of an anguishing situation. The possibility of eroticization, so we are told all over the place, of an anguishing situation that is sought out as such in order to get off on it. So here we have, at the peak of anxiety, a bizarre turn towards jouissance, a wellhead of the split subject's enjoyment, to the point even of capturing that ultimate experience of jouissance, orgasm. Now, it's tempting to think about this in terms of couples that fight in order to fuck, and that in fact might have a pretty quick turnaround of fight fucking on a regular basis. The notion of makeup sex here comes to mind as well. So also, though, does this Lacanian notion of enjoying one's symptom. What I would like to suggest is that another way to read this wellhead of jouissance that comes from anxiety is to think about all the ways that we get off on being overwrought. All the ways that as anxious, generalized, or acute subjects, we find ourselves accessing jouissance at the level of the symptomatic expression of what ails us, of our own anxiety. Enjoying one's symptoms strikes me as another way of talking about the transition from anxiety to jouissance, especially if you're symptomatic of anxiety. You might also think of examples where somebody who is anxious passes over into a fit of rage. Rage also counts as jouissance. In fact, I just saw an example of this today. Saw someone leaving my building. I know which car is hers. It's parked on the curb just down the street. I was walking the dog. I just walked by her car. The side window had been busted out the night before. Somebody broke into her car, stole all her shit, whatever. She sees her car window missing and doesn't just open the door, leaving the building to go check on her car. She pushes the door so hard that it slams open and hits the side of the building and leaves a dent in the wall. Here we see a moment of anxiety. What has been taken from me? What has been stolen from my car? What am I missing? What an invasion of my personal space. And in San Francisco, it's just like this shit just happens day in and day out. What's been taken from me? I'm anxious about it. What did they take from me when I wasn't there? Hear me now. Transformed into a fit of anger. And here's what happened next. I saw her. I know her. We walk over to her car together. If you've ever seen a broken car window, it's not like all the glass just suddenly falls in. It goes into these little balls, these little cubes, that's basically there to cut you up without killing your ass when shit goes south in a car accident, right? If it was all like sharp plates of glass, you'd be fucking dead. All of us would probably be dead at this point. But she starts rattling the remnant cubes of glass out of the window. And sure enough, just because they're tiny cubes doesn't mean they can't cut you. She winds up with not a squirting cut, but a dripping cut that won't stop. Her gash kept oozing, to the point that when I was calling the city, basically just to tell them that there's glass on the sidewalk, come pick that shit up. I walk my dog and people up and down the street, you know, pick up the glass, and the city will come and sweep it up. I looked down with my phone to take the image, and I realized that the glass across the pavement and the sidewalk plate was now splattered with blood. Not sprayed, but drips, large pools, sometimes even a dime size. And I said, yo, you know, you're bleeding. Like, I'm not trying to get all up in that, like, I'll help you, but like, there's blood now on your car door, there's blood on the sidewalk. This is almost certainly what I came here to tell you about. I didn't realize it though until this afternoon when the shit went down and this person had her car broken into. She was in a state of jouissance. Her anxiety very quickly passed over into a much more affective state, a state of bodily intensification, to the point of having her ass carved up on the object of her anxiety and not even notice it. I'm like, how can you not even notice that you got blood at your feet? There's blood on your car door. And she's like, they didn't even take my audio cable. What she realized, actually, nothing had been taken from her car. Nothing was missing. Things were out of place, but nothing was gone. It was a bizarre experience. I'm not entirely sure what to do with it, but I bring it up as an illustration of the way that fits of anxiety can condition outbursts of jouissance. So these are some examples, building on what Lacan is saying about nursing and vampirism and this whole imagery of flowing jouissance. It's not our final word tonight, but it is a pausing place, because I think it's a pretty wild contention that on the other side of desire is anxiety, and on the other side of anxiety is jouissance.
Yeah, it makes me think about the hysteric as, I mean, Freud defines the hysteric differently, but he begins it with conversion disorder, right? He's thinking about transplanting huge amounts of energy from one place to another, normally into the body for the hysteric, right? Mm. So based on sort of your story, is the hysteric just constantly in the state of overflowing jouissance?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not for Lacan, at least. I think Lacan, I can't speak for Freud as much, but I think that for Lacan, the hysteric, if they're overflowing with anything, it's desire. The hysteric is somebody who is constantly in search of masters, not to be mastered, but in order to undermine them, to show them and to force them to confess that they know dick. All the while, what the hysteric doesn't realize is that that constant provocation of others, of big others, of masterful others, is what gets her off. Now, that does lend itself to jouissance. But I think what I mean here by get off is more like kept in a state of desire, where she's constantly longing for, but never allowing herself to access. And I use the feminine here just because from all the analysts I've spoken with, all they say is, listen, I can't say that hysteria is a fundamentally masculine or feminine clinical structure. I mean, don't forget, Freud also learns about hysteria from studying guys coming home from World War I with quote unquote shell shock. He was like, oh, damn, this is hysteria too. So it's never been a strictly feminine position, even though we know the origin of the word hysteria comes from hyster, the word for uterus in Greek, and that whole horrible tradition. But in this case, hysteria would be something that, according to my analyst friends, it's just what they notice. Subjects who come in identifying as women tend to be more inclined towards hysteria, and subjects who come in identifying more as men tend to be more drawn towards obsessional neurosis. It doesn't mean it's always that way. I think what it just means is that when you live in an intensely heteronormative society, the feminized body is inclined towards hysteria in the field of disordered desire, and the masculinized body is drawn or lured or pushed towards an obsessional state of disordered desire. And I say disordered because it's not fun to be obsessive. Even if you just have like some obsessional characteristics, that fucking sucks. It's kind of embarrassing. And truth be told, it's not fun to be a hysteric. To be a hysteric is to love being chased, but you never actually get to have great sex. You never actually want to get caught. And in fact, one of the great dilemmas of hysteria is that if all you get off on is provoking other people's desire, then you can never get off on allowing them to satisfy it. Because as soon as you give yourself to them, if they're truly the desirous beings that you've attracted, they don't want you anymore. They only want what they can't have. So the dilemma of playing hard to get, which is a very normal way of realizing hysteria, is that you only attract people who get off on the chase, but don't ever want to catch what they're running after. And as a result, you just wind up fucking lonely. You attract people that like you from afar. You enjoy, if you will, the systematic frustration of your desire. So, Cody, what I would say is that if the hysteric is going to tap into something like jouissance, it is going to be at the level of enjoying their symptoms. And the basic symptom of hysteria is a desire that is constantly frustrated. It lives in a state of frustration. Like, or as I put it earlier, it's about being wanted by all and never actually having good sex with any of them. Now, men can do that, women can do that. In the field of everyday experience, you might even say that the masculinized body is one that is taught more than ever to want what you can't have and to not want what comes your way. So it's not so split as that. But I would say that in the case of hysteria and with obsessional neurosis, what you typically see is enjoyment accessed at the level of the symptom, at least according to Lacan. But the basic underlying motor of hysteria is a dysfunctional desire. It doesn't mean that it's not working. It means it's like overworking. It's operating, but at a level that doesn't allow it to do anything except completely fuck with somebody's life. In other words, it becomes a maladaptive experience and not something that's just kind of like the way we live as beings who occupy positions in the symbolic. It's more extreme than that. And that becomes the vessel and the opportunity for jouissance. So that's how I would get hysteria from a Lacanian point of view in the direction of enjoyment, at the level of enjoying that symptom, getting off on having your desire frustrated. You know these people. People who have all these big ideas about all the shit they want to do, and it never quite works out for them. And they just spend their lives in a state of, oh, you know, I totally could have done that. I totally could have been the guy. Oh my gosh, I had that idea. I was going to buy Twitter. I can't even believe this guy's going to buy Twitter. I was going to buy Twitter. That was my idea. I can't believe somebody did that before me. God, oh, I'm so frustrated. Motherfucker, I'm so frustrated. Elongated musket, this motherfucker shows up, always buy. I can't believe he. Okay, now, frustration of desire has passed over into jouissance. That's what we're after here. A desire that has been so overwrought that it now functions as enjoyment. Note also that Cody had added an emphasis on the bodily concentration of this energy in the hysteric, which is why the examples that you just heard were all clinging pretty close to experiences of sexuality and other people and couplings of various sorts, embodied experiences. And that for Lacan is the truth of desire. Desire is always embodied, and desire is always for another body. That's why I always start our discussions of desire by reminding you that it's desire for another. The suckling infant experiences desire for the body, one part in particular, of the maternal figure. The oral drive has as its object, its partial object, the breast. And then you have all these stand-ins for that later in life. So somebody with an oral drive or an oral fixation, if you want to call it that, might be somebody who, like you might have a dog, for instance. You might have a dog that when they get nervous, they kind of smack their lips. This can oftentimes be associated with weaning a dog too early. If the dog is pulled away from the nursing mother too early, it can happen with children too. They don't ever have that desire satisfied in any regard. And in fact, it only exacerbates it. You could have people who go from nursing to weaning to sucking their thumbs to chewing on their fingernails to smoking cigarettes to cigarettes that go really well with having a cocktail on the other hand. All these oral drives. Each of those entities, these partial objects, whether it's a pacifier or a cigarette, is a stand-in for the breast that in this case would have been taken away too soon. But these partial objects that incite the drive are all stand-ins for the original partial object, which in this case was the breast. And that doesn't mean you have to have been breastfed in order to have like an oral fixation, or poorly breastfed in order to have one either. But I want to get at this notion that the drive always runs a circuit around a certain kind of object. And there's an original version of that object. The oral drive's primary object is the breast. The anal drive's primary object is feces, shit. And that doesn't mean that you're a scatophile and you like people smearing crap all over you. That's not what this is about. It might just mean that you're the kind of person who likes to put away their shit at the end of the day. You might be the kind of person who can't go to sleep unless the dishwasher is loaded or unless all the dishes are done. You might be somebody who always has to have the picture perfectly mounted between the two walls so that it's directly centered. You got your tape measure out, you're penciling up the wall. You want to make sure that the poster hangs just right. Now, that's not shit that you're pinning up on your wall, but it is your shit. The same goes for the invocatory drive. Its partial object is the voice, but there can be many other stand-ins for the voice, like a horn that motherfuckers blow on certain holidays. You see? You did the reading, you know what I'm talking about. And it goes on and on. The scopic drive as well. Interestingly, the partial object around which the scopic drive circulates, guess what it is? Yes, it's the gaze.
Gaze.
That's right. Somebody mouthed it but didn't have their mic on. That's exactly right. It's the gaze. Yeah. It's that tin can that can't see you but is looking back at you nonetheless.
So that seems closest to anxiety, right? Like, I mean, if we sort of riff on the praying mantis situation, right? That the tension or the jouissance that's gained, if we use anxiety as sort of a starting point, is in being determined by the other's gaze, or within the tension of that gaze, right? Are you gonna fuck me? Are you gonna kill me? Are you, like, right?
I'm glad.
I mean,
I'm glad you bring that up, Cody, because check this out, y'all. In the chapter on Buddha's eyelids, he's talking about this statue in whose quote unquote eyes, because they don't exist there, you can't see a reflection. Nothing is reflected. Now, if you flip all the way back to the very start of this seminar, on page 6, starting at the top, the whole thing was well underscored by the fact that, as I confessed, I couldn't see my own image in the enigmatic mirror of the insect's ocular globe. We didn't talk about that when we ran the praying mantis example. It's a weird little add-on. We get sucked into this example of the praying mantis at the bottom of 5, and then he throws this bit at us at the very end. The fact that he couldn't see his own reflection in the insect's ocular globe. And then you flip forward 200 pages to 224 or thereabouts. Let's see if my memory still works. And here you have, if I'm not mistaken, there's even a reference in this chapter to the fucking insect. Oh, you may have to find it on your own. But the very same figure is occurring here. Human eyes are like mirrors. If you look carefully, you can see your own reflection in someone else's eyes. That's Lacan's point. But here we have an eye in which nothing is reflected. That conversation which begins on 223 and continues into 224, and all the way through the remainder of this chapter. It's the same eye of the praying mantis. So you feel as though the praying mantis is looking at you, and it's desirous. You don't know what it wants, but you figure you are somehow caught up in it. But you cannot see yourself in its reflection. This is a mirror that does not reflect your image back to you. And it is also the paradigmatic example of anxiety. Whatever else happens when we look at ourselves in front of a mirror, I would say anxiety is like at the top of my list. Maybe horror, maybe repulsion, maybe some version thereof. Think of all the feelings we have when we look at ourselves in the mirror. I don't know, man. Anxiety is definitely one of them. But what makes me feel even more anxious than seeing myself before a clear mirror is what happened to me the other day. I had just cleaned my bathroom. I Windexed the mirror. That shit was polished. It looked so good. And then that night, I'm getting ready for bed. I'm doing my routine. I'm flossing my teeth. And I'm, doing the floss, and I shit you not, a piece of flesh from my dinner came flying out of my mouth and stuck on my clean ass mirror. And I was like, that is fucking nasty. And so I get a little square of toilet paper and I grab it to pull it off. And you know what it did? It just fucking smeared. I tried to pull the speck of filth off this mirror and it smeared. And I was just horrified with myself. I was such a fucking beast in that moment. I was like a failure because I had done a good job cleaning the bathroom and then I just fucked it up again. And I'm half naked, so I'm probably not going to go walking back out into the kitchen and grab the Windex and then go back. You know, I got to get dressed again. I got to cover up myself. This is very close to the experience of anxiety. This is very close to the gaze. The speck of food on the mirror is the stain, and the smear is the stain. It doesn't mean that speck of food is looking back at me. It doesn't mean it has eyes to see me. It means, though, that I'm being watched. I'm still being seen in some way. I'm being called out, and called out in a very specific way. The mirror, when it was clean, held my perfect, although highly imperfect, body. It showed me I was whole. My nipples were symmetrical. My body, primo. Everything was squared away. I'm not saying it looked good. I'm a hideous machine. But at least I was a whole machine. I've got my floss in my hands. All my fingernails are about the same length. I don't have too much of a tan line because it's San Francisco and we're all naked all the time anyway, except for newspapers. You have to bring a newspaper with you so that when your bare ass gets on the bus, you can sit on the newspaper. You can be naked as fuck all you want, but you got to have that newspaper. Otherwise, you can't ride public transit. Everything else is good to go because they don't want your crack touching the seat, you know, priorities there, because it might leave a stain. You feel me? I'm not the stain. My bodily form, naked in the streets of San Francisco, is not the stain. The stain is what my ass leaves on the bus seat if I don't have my newspaper with me. Now, I bring all this up to tell you about the being that was called forth in that moment. When I was before the mirror, hideous though I am, I was a whole, reflected, coherent body. As soon as that smudge appeared, I was broken. There was something in that mirror that no longer reflected me back to me. There was something in that mirror that had been thrown out, cast out of my body, and now became a barrier or a bar to my whole reflection. Now, when I looked at the mirror, what I couldn't see was my whole gestalt, my whole image of myself, my specular image. What I couldn't see was my little I next to little a, my specular image. What I saw instead was what I lack, where I lack, how I lack. What I saw was the flesh, from the fact that proves that I'm still that bioanimalistic, annihilating subject of pure need. That food was caught in my teeth all night. How many other people noticed me in that state? They may have been listening to my silver tongue and my $20 words, but all they could think about was that speck of food caught in my teeth. What was on display in my teeth? We have a symbol for that. It's a symbol that you've seen quite often. This is what was in my teeth. This is what popped out. This is what stuck to the mirror. And I went from being your regular old run-of-the-mill desirous subject, living my life in search of what other people want, living my life around lack and desire and the pursuit of all forms of happiness I can manage, to being castrated. That is what popped out of my mouth and stuck to the mirror, was my castration. That was how I now appeared before myself. not as somebody who had an aging body, but nevertheless, a body still symmetrical in some ways, coherent, as every specular image should be. But now I was a body that was stained. There was something off with me. Some part of the mirror no longer functioned. Now, what was reflected in that mirror when the image of my castration hit it? The answer is on page 224 and 223. Nothing. I went from being something to being nothing. And that mirror went from being something in which other things can be reflected to a surface in which nothing is reflected. A surface in which nothing is reflected. The nothing here, you know where I'm going to go with this, is the no thing that traces its origin to the name of the Father, to the no of the Father, to the moment of castration, the moment of prohibition, when I was told I couldn't simply cry anymore and get what I wanted. I now had to use words, to the very origin of my splitting as a subject. This process of alienation, where the subject of pure need has to find their way into and out of the symbolic. That's why he's talking about the beauty stain. That's why the gaze comes up. And that's why I'm so glad, Cody, that you bring up the praying mantis and the eye in which nothing is reflected at the very start of this seminar. Y'all don't even know how good you are. You're on fire. You are on fire in ways. We've been doing this 5 sessions. We got one more ahead of us. Y'all are saying shit you don't even know. In fact, I can look around this room right now for the screens I can see, and I can remember shit that each of you has said that has totally blown my mind and left me wondering, holy fuck, I gotta account for that somehow. Everybody gets a turn. More questions before I try to take another. Let me go back to our shared screen with all this wackadoo shit up here.
So Sam, did you hopscotch from castration back to your ideal ego in that mirror moment? You how long did it take for you to get back to a structured synthetic whole that, yeah.
I have to say, I tried. When I grabbed the square of toilet paper and went back to the mirror, I was like, I can fix this. I can make this whole again. It's going to be okay. No one has to know. And I can leave the bathroom and it's almost like it will not have happened. See what I'm saying? Now, I don't mean that in that moment I would foreclose the bit of that came out, as if to say that didn't happen and that didn't occur. Not that extreme. You hear me now alluding to psychosis in response to the name of the Father. I'm not going to say that I disavowed that moment. Here I'm alluding to perversion and the operational logic thereof, which is disavowal. I basically repressed it. I was just a stone cold neurotic dipshit in that moment. And I tried to wipe it off. And that, Cody, was the extent of my effort to regain my ego, to put the shit back online so that all my efforts at cleaning, whether it's the mirror or my teeth, notice the imageries I'm using here. This struck me for many reasons. It's a freshly cleaned mirror, and there I am trying to freshly clean my teeth in front of it. It's all about tidying up cleaning things up. And that's when it all falls apart. Now, I'm not saying I was crying at the toilet and, whatever. It wasn't like I, completely fell apart. It wasn't like there was an existential crisis begun in that moment. But it's that kind of shit that Lacan has in mind. We talk about anxiety and all these big states. We talk about the way that the big lacking other forces us, as Lacan says on 46, to turn our fundamental negativity, namely our castration, into a positivity that guarantees the function of the other. Here he means the function of the other as whole. Now, I'm not making this up. I'm quoting from page 46 of our seminar. This is where he's talking about the neurotic shrinking back from the big other as lacking and the big lacking other's demand that the split subject show it, prove it, show me your castration. Don't show me that you lack. Show me the cut. Show me the scar where the knife was inserted. I don't want to see your foreskin that was removed. What I want to see is the scar tissue around the head of your dick. Show me. That is at a profound, extreme level what it feels like to be anxious. What would have been experienced as an opening for desire, here symbolized in the removal of foreskin, and now becomes a sign of your dependency, of the fact that you're not whole, that something's been removed from you. You're missing a part. You've been cut. And the big other says, show me. I want to see it. And that's a point of anxiety. And what I've suggested here tonight is that in that moment, the usual course of things, where the symbol for castration, lowercase phi subtracted in parens, giving way to object A, a cause of desire, an opening for desire, is reversed. In anxiety, the big other shows up and takes the opening in which you would have otherwise pursued your desire and says, yeah, let's go back a step though. Let's talk about where that opening came from, about the cut, not the gap that's left behind, but the incision that produced it. Show me where you're cut. That's the moment of anxiety. According to Lacan, and here all we're doing is we're reading the seminar carefully and we're just working with the terms he's given us. I don't know if any of this makes any sense, but I think it's pretty coherent with what he's been up to here. And I am prepared to map this thing out in a diagram that it has more parts than any diagram I've ever drawn for Lacan. I don't know if it's going to make sense, but it's a map of sorts. And it kind of looks like what happens when you flush a turd down the toilet. We're about to do it, but I want to make sure that we get questions answered before then. Okay, you all. Here we go. What I'm going to now try and do, emphasis on the word try, is combine a bunch of the stuff we've been talking about into a single image. And I'm going to try and write small because Lord knows this is going to take a minute. Okay, I think it's all there. And now we can talk about it and work it through. Here's where things start. This is the subject of pure need, this J0 that we've been messing with, and the delta that symbolizes this mythical presupposed state, this utero experience that we've talked so much about. Now enters the imaginary. From the here and now of the all in the process of becoming, that is a quote from Lacan, to this imaginary triangle that we've been working with, all about the mother's desire. This is a shift from the here and now to the imaginary. So far, this is all review. Here, we see a shift from the imaginary to the symbolic. You may even do better to think of this as an addition. Here is castration. Here is the big other, where this individual, subject of pure need, must pass through the defiles of the signifier and the big other, resulting in this process known as castration. Now, if you recall the table that we've been working with, here's the S passing over into the A of the big other in the process known as castration, and you know that two things come out of this process: the object cause of your desire and a split subject. What you see here is a shift from the symbolic to what in this seminar Lacan is going to talk about as the real. Because remember, object A is a real part, an irreducible leftover from the process of castration. And it results in a splitting of the subject. This is what I would describe as a shift from lack to desire. Here's lack, and here's the desirous subject. Now, the mobilization of desire that we know about is called fantasy. Here we have our split subject living their life in relation to whatever they think other people want, whatever it is that they experience, in other words, as lacking this individual. But we know that desire and fantasy can run aground. And one of the places that fantasy runs aground is when it encounters a signifier of the other's lack. So here what we're seeing is desire to fantasy. Here what we're seeing is from fantasy here to anxiety. In this realm, if you're following along with the graph of desire, here's a signifier of the lack in the other. And you can see that this is actually a tracing, more or less, based on the graph of desire. What we see here in this example is the origin of desire. What we see down here is not the origin of desire, but the origin of anxiety. Now we get to the important stuff. I've told you tonight in reading Lacan that anxiety is not the end of things. This mythical state of jouissance that spins out as follows, eventually resulting in a pass from desire to anxiety, is also the wellhead for something else. A shift from anxiety to what in the graph of desire we know as the matheme for the drive. Drive, as we know, as a partial instantiation of desire that we've talked about. And you can see where we're going next. This is the topmost arc in the graph of desire, where drive is passing to a new form of jouissance. Not this mythical form of jouissance that we assign to the subject of pure need, and incorrectly, of course, as we've already noted, because that's not jouissance. Jouissance is an effect of prohibition. So it can't be there before prohibition. So we really should put this again in quotation marks here. But a certain other kind of jouissance, what Lacan talks about at the very end of his essay on the graph of desire, where jouissance is given up in order to be regained on the inverse scale ladder arc of desire. Here is proper jouissance, accessed via the drive. At this point, desire is operating, but it is no longer the medium in which you live. Keeping the drive alive is about finding ways to experience enjoyment in the midst of this field established by castration, which is why if you're looking at the graph of desire, you can see that castration is out here. It's a reminder that even though you're pursuing the drive and keeping it alive as best you can, you are always doing so within a field of castration. I mean, at this point, what you've realized is that you're not the only lacking other in the scene. The big other themselves also has a few gaps. You're not the only one that's castrated. The question that we're going to leave unanswered for now is what comes next. Is this just a simple looping around of the top of the graph of desire? Is there a beyond here? One of you has suggested that the beyond here might be love. There might be room for something like love out here, which, as you've heard me say, would be a split subject, living their lives not in relation to the demand of the big other, but another split subject. It's possible. Now, if I was a better artist, this would effectively look like a swirl of some kind. As I know you're a better reader, you can also look at this and pretty thoroughly map this into the graph of desire. You can also map this into the table on 174 that Lacan is working up in the middle section of this seminar. Each of these components also has a place in the ontology I offered tonight. This is pretty much where we find ourselves now, with this very bizarre expression that anxiety can be the wellhead of jouissance. This is where we find ourselves on the eve of our final session. I'm going to go ahead and save this before things go south. But also now I want to open the floor for questions, comments. If you want me to explain anything more, I'm glad to do it. If you want to think about a way to do this too, let your eyes follow the trajectory that I've outlined, but also do this. Note the relationships that are established with this map. There's a lateral field where 5 terms line up, and a vertical plane in which 5 terms line up. Now, it maps pretty well when you start thinking about the origin of desire and the origin of anxiety. This is what we've been talking about tonight. But what an interesting trajectory suggested by this. I think it's easy enough to see this trajectory, but how about this one? And maybe this is the path that would allow us to come up with an answer to this question. After all, doesn't it have the same structure? Here and here. We see the same structural parallel in the definition I've given of love. It could work. Just a thought, though.
Can I ask why it's a lozenge for the love math theme? Because I mean, I don't know, what worries me about that is it doesn't seem like it's a reciprocal relationship at all. Not that the lozenge implies reciprocity, but yeah, I mean, in Seminar 20, for example, he says that there is no, sexual relationship, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just curious if you can maybe explain why it's not maybe a question mark between those two or something like that.
I think a question mark could work too. When I'm not doing Lacanian stuff, another symbol that I use in here just to suggest that there's some sort of a connection. It's just too little. It's just a collection of dots, which can suggest like an analogical relationship. But I like the lozenge here for all the reasons that Lacan does, because it suggests all of these different possibilities. It doesn't have to be a relationship. And here I'm thinking of Lacan's use of the French rapport. So I'm not here suggesting that there is a sexual relationship in the Lacanian sense that he works out in 20. I mean, what I would just read this lozenge as here is as saying, living a life in relation to, maybe in response to, or if you don't like that, alongside, attentive to, reactive to even. But I like that living a life in relation to. In fantasy, you see somebody living their life in relation to what they think other people want from them. There's that A. Out here, if indeed we're going to put love, and I don't even know if this is the best matheme for love. It's the one that I think is the most workable and suggestive.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think of this. If it was the signifier of the split other, because I mean, when we're talking about love, it's giving. It's a gift, right? It's giving something that you lack to someone that doesn't want it. So yeah, it's interesting that the signifier doesn't come up here, right?
Yeah. So maybe if we drew it, then the signifier of the lack in the subject. This would also line up with some other things that Lacan routinely says. Maybe something along those lines. Because he is very careful in suggesting that the subject is a signifier presented to another signifier. And that might do the work of keeping us a little truer to what he's doing in Seminar 20. When he refuses to allow there to be a rapport between the masculinized body and the feminized body. Now that's a different seminar, and I would also offer that as a possibility. If we wanted to take this into Seminar 20 and do a close, careful reading of 20 the way that we have done for 10, I'm open to that. We've tried it before. And some of you have even done reading groups on Seminar 20. You know it's wild. You know we could spend some time working with it. A lot of people have made a lot of 20. And I would certainly be willing, if that's the lay of the land, to give it a go with y'all. But so I'm all about thinking of new ways to mathematize, if you will, love. This one has the benefit of simplicity, but I think this one might have a little more truth to it. So I really appreciate the suggestion. What else, my friends? You can see me, but I can't see you.
For the spiral, is this like a universal path of the graph of desire, or what specific subject is it for?
I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. The graph of desire does a really good job in many ways of mobilizing thought and allowing us to kind of work our way through here. This one has the added benefit of providing us with a coherent image that allows us to really narrate our reading of Seminar 10. So this is kind of like the image. If Seminar 10 begins with the graph of desire, this is where I would have us end, is with something like this. And I may be premature in offering this because we do have another session. This isn't our final pass at this. What kind of a subject would this be for? I offered the earlier bit about the move from the subject of pure need into the imaginary pre-Oedipal triangle, into the symbolic square, into the emergence of A and the arrival as a split subject, desirous and with fantasy. I'm offering this up as ontological. I'm willing to go that far. I would like to suggest that if you are in the field of language, if you are a human who occupies a position in the symbolic, all of these things are going to be popping at some level for you. Now we know that a lot of other things could happen. This is very much a schematic based on how I understand neurosis functioning. And again, just from reading Lacan. You might run this through logics of perversion and come up with something really different, because depending on how this all crucial element, the origin of desire, depending on how castration plays out, you can have a lot of different trajectories here. If castration, the name of the father, is completely foreclosed, you're not going to have this spin out in the same way, if at all. So the subject this is for is a neurotic subject. If we were going to trace this through a psychotic subject, we'd come up with something different. In fact, what I would suggest is some of these same terms might be moved around. You might even say that in the case of psychosis, these two positions would be swapped out. Except instead of A here, you might just have a big old fat D. The fattest D imaginable of a completely delusional big other. That's not big other in the symbolic sense, but delusional in the imaginary sense. So we're talking about aliens. We're talking about the NSA, Colonel Sanders, the Queen of England, you know the types. Putin now occupies this for many who flirt with psychosis. He's the big D right now. The demanding other that forces you to, I don't know, not use your cell phone in certain circumstances, wrap your head in tinfoil, pray to your gods and the like. So a lot turns on what happens here. If the name of the father and this experience of castration is completely rejected, you're going to have a different spin out in the case of psychosis. If it's partial, if it's incomplete, if it's completely shot through with jouissance, namely in the case of perversion, you're also going to have something different coming out. In fact, what I would suggest is in the case of perversion, what would appear here is not the big D, as you would see in psychosis, but instead a return of the imaginary phallus. Because what the pervert holds on to by disavowing castration is some hope that they can be exactly what the big other lacks. The hope for perversion is that the big other might not have the phallus, but by God, I can be it for them. The pervert wants nothing more than to be the tool for your jouissance. They want to be your dildo. They want to be your pocket pussy. They want to be the thing that is there, an inanimate object that is just there to get you off. And so as you can see, like, if the experience of castration is partial, as in the case of perversion, the next step is not going to be the emergence of little a. It might instead be a return of the imaginary object, of the phallus that you as pervert think you can be for some other big other. And it might spin out from there. The split subject would not be what happens next. Instead, you might encounter the barred other, the lacking other that you hope to satisfy. And what we know about perversion, forgive me, but I'm just going to spin it out at this point. What we know about perversion is that the matheme for the, quote, fantasy of perversion, if we can even call it that, is just the opposite of the one for neurosis. This is what perversion looks like. I want to be that thing for you. So I think that what we have in front of us right now, in answer to this great question, is a neurotic spin out of these terms. If you wanted to make it a perverse spin out, we can do that, and it would just be a substituting of terms. If you wanted to make it a psychotic spin out, we could do that too. Now, maybe it would reorient the entire graph. But what we have here is that of a more or less normal subject. And I say that not in the sense of right or wrong. I say that in the sense of average, what usually happens when somebody is fully integrated into the symbolic. And I also say fully with quotation marks, because as we know, there's always some irreducible part of the subject of pure need, the bioanimalistic subject that is the start of all of this, the very origin of human life as we individuals know it. There's always some part of that body that cannot be metabolized by the symbolic, that cannot be signified. That becomes the origin of the real. That, in the case that Lacan is describing in Seminar 10, is what we see right here. The part that cannot be metabolized by the symbolic is excluded. But we know that it's an interior exclusion, by the way. Little a, pages 160, 161. By the way, you can do a careful reading of Icree and see this very same thing over and over again. The real is not there before the symbolic. It's what gets kicked out of the process of symbolization, what the symbolic can't process. The real is an effect structure, as you heard me say at the start of our time together, and probably in other scenarios too. Now, it's 9 o'clock. I love you all. I'm happy to hang out and talk more. So keep the questions coming. I know some of you are just arriving because we're on different time zones. I'm absolutely willing to hang out for another 30 minutes or so and talk more about any of this. I'll flip back to the image so we can keep looking at it. Much as you like. Let's see. Looks like we have 18 people still on this call. You all are kick ass. Now we're at 6. What the hell are you 6 still doing here if you don't want to talk about something? All right, I'm going to stop sharing and come back and join you full force. But only in together mode. Skype is such a horrible platform. I'm really sorry I did this to you all. I would use Zoom, but I was warned by the university not to use their resources for this outside the curriculum, this extracurricular get-together that I've been hosting. I'm like, whose laptop do you think I'm hosting this event on?